While at university, my friends and I noticed every week that one of the bins of the biggest supermarkets in Bristol was always full of food that was still perfectly fresh and edible, but had just been thrown away because it was past its sell-by date. We started to wonder whether we could use this food for another purpose, and we managed to salvage a lot of it using a bicycle and wagon, and we cooked up huge feasts for ourselves. After a number of these feasts, we wondered whether actually this food could go a bit further than just feeding a few undergrads. So we dug a little deeper and we found out the following. In the UK, over 4 million people suffer from food poverty. This is the equivalent of the whole of Ireland struggling to eat 3 meals a day. At the same time, supermarkets throw away over 300,000 tonnes of food every year. This is the equivalent of the weight of the Empire State Building. Food poverty and food waste should not coexist in today's society. Moreover, food poverty is not just about hunger, it's also about isolation. Because someone living on £2 a day isn't wondering whether they can meet a friend at the pub or go for coffee with another friend. Instead, they are wondering whether their budget will stretch to paying for breakfast as well as lunch, as well as dinner. Social isolation is a lack of contact with the wider community. It can affect anyone, but there are particular links to socioeconomic background, physical and mental health, and age. Indeed, in the UK, over 1 million older people say they feel lonely almost always, or at least very often. 6% of them leave their homes just once a week or less. And further research has shown that over 97% of our communities have become more socially fragmented over the past 30 years. But how can we solve this? One way of doing this is by reducing food waste. So I'd like to quantify that for you today. Every day, 2 million tomatoes are thrown away in the UK. 1 million oranges are also thrown away. And 2 million bananas. But it's also important to think about the global food supply. And I'd like to use an example taken from a world expert on food waste to illustrate this. Let's imagine that these 9 bananas represent the global food supply. The first banana we're going to lose before we even leave the fields. That's to do with problems associated with developing agriculture, a lack of pasteurization, refrigeration, etc. The next 3 bananas represent the food that we feed to our livestock. Now, animals are very inefficient creatures, and they turn 2/3 of this into feces and heat, which leaves us with just 1, which represents our meat and dairy products. 2 more bananas we throw away. This is the food that we throw away that's gone off in our fridges, that supermarkets throw away, which isn't necessarily off. So we're left with just 4 out of the original 9 bananas that we started with, which is, of course, less than half of the original food supply. I'd also like to point out, however, that while developed and underdeveloped countries account roughly evenly for the 1.3 billion tonnes of food that is wasted every year, the nature of that waste is in fact very different. In developed countries, food is wasted throughout the consumption chain, whereas in places like sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, most food is wasted very early on due to the agricultural issues I alluded to previously. What we need to do as a community, as a society, and actually with the help of development agencies, the UN and other governments, is work together to discourage these wasteful practices in order to help the millions of smallholders who are experiencing an exacerbation of food insecurity. But how can we actually do this? One very good place to start is supermarkets. This year in May, it became illegal in France for supermarkets to throw away food that was perfectly edible but past its sell-by date. This came as a direct result of one MP who spearheaded an initiative to raise awareness about the great swathes of people, marginalised, unemployed, mentally ill, and whole families who were surviving by stealthily foraging in bins to find food to survive on. Another great organisation that does this is FoodCycle, and there are several others who do a similar process. But FoodCycling is the process of moving food from supermarkets, surplus food of course, using surplus kitchen spaces and willing volunteers to cook up the food and redistribute it on a weekly basis for the people who actually need it. FoodCycle is a great example of something which bridges both food poverty and social isolation because it brings people together under the communal setting of a meal. If we go back to the global food supply, I'd like to point out that if we were to cut the food waste that we do by a quarter, we would be able to solve world famine. It seems that also in the developed world, we waste almost 9 times more than people who do waste it in underdeveloped countries. This suggests that the real differentiator is the value that we attach to the food. And I would just encourage you to find out about projects near you like FoodCycle and other initiatives and get involved. Thank you very much.